Welcome back to the third lecture in our rebirth, of Israel unit. We began by looking at the prehistory of the state of Israel, beginning with the Judenstaat by Theodor Herzl at the end of the 19th century and ending with the War of Independence, UN Resolution 181, and the state of Israel in the summer of 1948. Last time we looked at the definitive Arab-Israeli War, the 1967 Six-Day War, in which Israel defeated Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, and in the process took possession of the Sinai Peninsula, Golan Heights, the Gaza Strip, and, most importantly, the West Bank and the city of Jerusalem. Occupying that territory, however, created an enormous refugee problem in Jordan, in Syria, and in Lebanon. Today we're going to look at what happens when those refugees begin to fight back. Resistance, Intifada, Fatah, the PLO, and Hamas. Right, the story of the resistance begins in 1959. There had been sporadic outbreaks of violence between Palestinian Arabs and Israelis prior to 1959, to be sure. It is with 1959 that we see the formation of Fatah, a paramilitary group with the avowed intent of removing Israeli occupation from the West Bank and other territories. Fatah took as its symbol the kafiyah, the checkered headscarf that was also the symbol of the 1936 to 1938 Arab Revolt. And though he did not found Fatah, Yasser Arafat, born in 1929, very quickly became its leader. 5 years after the founding of Fatah, a larger organization was brought together, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, formed by members of Fatah and other Palestinian paramilitary groups. The PLO go on to be the driving force of Palestinian resistance. You can see here on the screen, on either side of the acronym PLO, the logo, or mark, if you will, of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. We see Arabic, denoting Palestinian Liberation Organization, but more importantly we see a flag, a black, white, green, and red flag. That is the Palestinian flag, a symbol of the resistance. Moreover, we see the outline of Israel, the entirety of Israel, the Negev, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and everything else. The Palestinian Liberation Organization's goal was not the removal simply of Israelis from the occupied territories, but of Jews from the entirety of what is today the state of Israel. The Palestinian Liberation Organization was headquartered from its inception in Jordan, on the opposite bank of the Jordan River from the occupied territory of the West Bank. However, as the Palestinian Liberation Organization began to make greater and greater attacks against Israeli targets, the king of Jordan, a man whom we've already met, King Hussein, decided that he could no longer tolerate this state within a state inside of his borders. And in 1970, in September of 1970, the Jordanian army attacked Palestinian Liberation Organization outposts in Jordan, resulting in the forced exile of PLO members from Jordan to Lebanon. It's remembered in the Palestinian community as Black September. It's regarded as a great act of treason, really, when you get down to it, by an Arab Muslim leader, King Hussein of Jordan. Hussein and the Jordanian officials had always had a working relationship of sorts with the Israelis, especially after the 1967 Six-Day War. Both saw Yasser Arafat and the PLO as a threat to their internal security, both Jordanian and Israeli. Moreover, the Jordanians, King Hussein in particular, were uncomfortable with such a militaristic group inside of their borders. Thus, the 1970 raid on all the PLO camps in Jordan, which results in their exile to Lebanon. Following their exile, the attacks by the PLO became more spectacular. They went from largely paramilitary actions against Israeli targets proper inside of the West Bank and inside of Israel to daring acts of international terrorism. Airline hijacking became one of their specialities. Perhaps the most famous and daring of the 1970 hijackings occurred in 1976 when an Air France flight was hijacked by Palestinian terrorists and taken to Entebbe, Uganda, of all places, where the passengers were separated out according to religion. Jews were selected out and removed from the rest of the passengers. Some of those Jews were actual survivors of the Holocaust. And to their eyes, what was happening was very much like the selection of Jews in Germany in the 1930s and 40s. Though it seemed that it would be impossible to rescue these hostages, seeing as they were so far away in Uganda, negotiation was not an option. And so 3 C-130 cargo planes were dispatched, the crack team of Israeli commandos. They flew to Entebbe under the cover of darkness in complete blackout, landed, deployed a Mercedes limousine, which looked very much like the limousine driven by Idi Amin, the dictator of Uganda, drove that limousine right up to the terminal where the hostages were being held, and opened fire. All hell broke loose, every terrorist was killed, and nearly every hostage was saved for a long flight back to Israel.
Air France Flight 139 to Paris makes a scheduled stop in Athens to pick up 58 additional passengers. Four of them travel on fake passports. They have no intention of going to Paris. They're working for the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, a radical terror group. The PFLP is one of several anti-Israeli factions set up to regain land lost to the Jewish state during the Six-Day War of 1967. Their preferred tactic is hijacking passenger jets. Pro-Palestinian groups have seized more than 50 aircraft over the past decade. This time, they target Athens airport because staff members are on strike. They are counting on security being lax. The gamble pays off. The terrorists board Flight 139, which departed from Tel Aviv in Israel earlier today. There are 246 passengers on board, many of them Israeli.